Welcome. I am Sara Pankenier Weld, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome our distinguished guest, director and producer Holly Morris, virtually to UC Santa Barbara for this event. Thank you so much for joining us today, Holly.
I am so glad to be here. Thanks for asking. And I'm really looking forward to your important conference tomorrow. And also, side note, both of my parents went to UCSB. So I just realized that's another interesting connection.
Fantastic. Well, they must be very proud of you today. So we're very happy to find you here, even if it is only virtually, after waiting for a year, since your actual visit 1 year ago was first delayed and then made virtual by the pandemic. But I hope you can visit us again in the future in person. And this 1 year delay, which you were the first person to note to me, actually makes these events even more relevant, since this year, this very week, it is now 35 years ago since the Chernobyl disaster took place. And we're really grateful to have you here to speak with us this evening and our audience, also as part of the events surrounding tomorrow's interdisciplinary conference, Fallout Chernobyl and the Ecology of Disaster. And we would love to extend a welcome to this evening's audience to the conference tomorrow as well. And Holly, I'm sure I speak for all our audience when I say how much we appreciate this chance to view and discuss your award-winning and thought-provoking film, which seems so fitting as we remember the events at Chernobyl 35 years ago and consider their long-lasting fallout even today, like the lives of these women indicate. I'd also like to take a moment now to acknowledge our sponsors that made this possible: the College of Letters and Science and the T.A. Barron Environmental Fund, the Department of Germanic and Slavic Studies, the Graduate Center for Literary Research, the Carsey-Wolf Center, thank you so much, as well as the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center, the Department of Global Studies, Comparative Literature, Environmental Studies, Cold War Studies, College of Creative Studies, and History Department. So as you see, we're all very enthusiastic to have you here. So thank you. So as viewers have seen and watching your wonderful film, the Babushkas of Chernobyl takes viewers into the exclusion zone and into the intimate lives of a number of remarkable older women who chose to return to their homes within the exclusion zone around the Chernobyl power plant after the disaster. It touches upon a wide range of interesting subjects, and I look forward to asking you about a number of these this evening in the time we have before we open to audience questions as well. So I thought I would start by asking you a question that I am imagining might be on the audience's mind, which is, what was it like to be there inside the exclusion zone and make this film?
Well, it is a singular place, to be sure. When I first went there, which was actually for the 25th anniversary of the accident. I was there as part of a film for a series called Globe Trekker I was doing for PBS. And we went there to cover the anniversary of the accident. And quite honestly, I was quite nervous about it, and when negotiating our time, one day in the zone and this and that. And I'm sure in the course of our talk, I'll tell you what it's like, but it was, you don't know what to expect. I will tell you, it is strangely gorgeous. The natural world has come booming back in the absence of humans. For the most part, not too many humans. The wolves, the wild boar, all kinds of animal life has come back. And so because the enemy there is invisible, the radiation, it's you have this sort of cognitive dissonance going on. On one hand, you see this beautiful place and with all this life. And on another hand, you know that it was a site of, a horrible disaster and ongoing contamination. So it's a funny place to be. And my first times there were quite scary, actually. And then you sort of get lulled into a kind of complacency. I mean, one is always mindful and following the radiation precautions, and we certainly did, but it's hard to stay on red alert. It's something about human nature. And I'm sure you'll be talking about this tomorrow in your conference, that you can know intellectually that it's very, and I'm sort of not speaking so much for myself, but for the people close who live there and in the area, like you can't live in the state of a 4-alarm fire all the time. And that creates a lot of dangerous situation for people. I'm not talking about the Babushkas so much, that people in the region are also living in contaminated areas. So I know I'm going on and on, but like the zone itself is arbitrary, right? You know, radiation spreads all over, and you can't build a fence and call it safe on one side of the fence and not on the other. So anyway, the threat to the human population is ongoing, really.
Thank you, Holly. I think you really, blasted open all the possibilities and so many topics that I'd love to get into further and in further questions in the time that we have. Thank you. You really bring us there, and with all the thought-provoking implications that has. So I'd love to ask you now how you first discovered this story and decided to make this film.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I was there for this essentially a travel program, Globe Trekker, and we filmed there for just 2 days. Went to the reactor, went to Pripyat, and then somewhere in the course of our time there, with our sort of monitor guide person mentioned Babushkas, and we saw evidence of people living inside the zone, and we're like, of course that was just fascinating to me. And so we went and interviewed a woman named Hannah, who became one of the film's primary characters down the line. And she was remarkable. And, we were there for such a brief period of time. After I came home, I kind of couldn't forget what it felt like there and who these women were. And I spent my career covering the stories of sort of unlikely heroines in risky environments sometimes. And so I went back and did a long print piece for a magazine, a New York magazine, and really spent more time with people. And then about a year after that, began filming. So it took, the story evolved in different ways. And it was quite important because you can't spend a ton of time there. There are lots of limitations on you go into the zone. It's like a checkpoint, like a border crossing, and you have to, be in for only a certain amount of days, a certain amount of hours a day, a certain amount of consecutive days. So it made the work of gathering the story challenging. But because I had done the print piece and I'd been back a number of times and gotten to know certain people, it sort of set the stage to make the film in a fairly efficient way. Meaning like, you can shoot a documentary for, years and hundreds of hours of footage, but that wasn't possible in such a place. So we ended up, I think it was 18 days of shooting inside the zone over the course of 2 years. So I'm wandering around, but that's sort of a production point. And then we filmed around the zone too, where we didn't need such special permission and precautions.
Yeah, no, fascinating. And actually you anticipate also, I'd love to ask you about how this film fits into the context of your other work. And I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, well, I started my career in book publishing, feminist book publishing in the 90s in Seattle. And as a part of that, did a lot of work in international women's fiction and nonfiction and women's health books, and a lot of travel and adventure. At the time in the 90s, there wasn't a lot of that. I mean, luckily times have changed and the publishing culture has changed, and there's more diversity and inclusion in terms of women in some of those genres. But so we'd sort of knock ourselves out, creating a book and sell 5,000 or 6,000 copies of this great translation of a Ukrainian writer. And it felt like frustrating, right? I wanted to help get those stories out more. So I shifted into film and television, did a series called Adventure Divas in around 2000, and that was an international sort of a part travel series, part sort of feminist pilgrimage. I didn't tell the travel, you know, the executives at the networks, oh, I'm making this crazy radical feminist, you know, we're explore cultures through the lens of, you know, it's radical women. But that wouldn't have gone over so big back then anyway. But that's what we were doing. So we were celebrating cultures through the eyes of you know, women who are changing their communities. That was, and then, you know, on from there doing different expedition projects, and always doing a Globe Trackers was sort of my side hustle next to my independent projects, and whether they were writing projects or film projects. So I guess the short answer is I've always wanted to try to work in media and try to let the characters tell stories that have been told in some, like, you know, the first Adventure Divas project I did was in Cuba, because, you know, Cuba was this sort of misunderstood place. And, you know, you heard, this was a while ago, still misunderstood though, but, you know, you heard about Castro and a couple other characters, and Che and communism. And, you know, that was one part of a story. And so telling the story of whether it's Cuba or Chernobyl, but through the lens of women and people who don't necessarily get to be the narrators of the story very often. So you don't find a bunch of 80-year-old women who get to tell the story of Chernobyl. But by doing that and honoring their experience, I think we get a whole broader look at the Chernobyl accident and culture. And so it's much more than, you know, the events of 1986 and, you know, three-legged deer kind of thing, which becomes often the takeaway in stories around Chernobyl.
Yes, and also the depth of past experience too, which we might have a chance to get to even before Chernobyl. All of it coalesces here in your film. Thank you, and through this beautiful angle that you achieve. I'd love to hear more about the experience of, you know, gathering these stories. So we get a very intimate experience of entering into the homes and the culture, the language, and the lives of these women, these extraordinary women who have lived extraordinary lives. And I wonder, was it hard to gain their trust and get access to their lives and experience? And did any language barriers get in the way?
I will tell you that we had a wonderful translator and sort of local producer named Marina Orkova, and she made it so much possible, you know, in terms of, because not only, well, the women spoke Ukrainian and Russian generally, but also dialects, regional dialects. So there are not too many people who could cover all those bases and also work in the context of a film. So I want to give her a lot of credit for the intimacy that you see in that film. That being said, I do think that, you know, there were some people who weren't interested in being filmed, but for the most part, you know, people were incredibly warm and welcoming. And if you've ever spent time with any babushka, you know, like, you kind of have to sit down and have some dumplings and some moonshine before, you know, definitely before you can roll the cameras. And so of course that gets complicated in a place like Chernobyl, where those are absolutely the things you shouldn't take part in. But I will tell you a short story. One time we were filming and we went into someone's house, and I think this was when I was for the newspaper or the magazine article, and this was just outside the village, but it was this outside the zone. And we went in this house and we're talking to this woman, and she picked up a phone. She actually had a phone, which is unusual. And she said, she called her neighbors and said, quick, come over. There's interesting people here and they're not missionaries. So it's like, you know, it was part of it was simple human connection. And because, you know, the sad truth is, I mean, there's a lot of affirmation and love and humor and stuff in the film, I think, but there's also a lot of suffering and loneliness in the Chernobyl zone. It's not easy to be there. So So yeah, so we found it, someone said, oh, is it difficult to get them to talk? And I'm like, yeah, actually we have more trouble getting them to stop talking sometimes when we're filming, which was another lovely part of it. Because as we were saying before we went live here, some of the best moments I feel in the film are things that weren't during an interview. They were just verite moments when we were filming, and we caught their natural conversations and their relationships and their values and the things they were proud of. And often it was some months later, there were little nuggets inside the film of once we got them translated at home in Brooklyn, even more of their story was able to come out on the screen. Your colleague pointed out the moment when Hannah was sort of arguing with her friend about blessing the moonshine. And that was one of those moments that while we were filming, we didn't even know it had happened.
Yeah, thank you, Holly. And I love how actually I see similarities now in your work with, as a film and what a film does in terms of opening up a pathway, and we see something we couldn't possibly ever see. And I love the way you're talking about language too, as this kind of bridge that opens up these opportunities. As a professor of Russian, I'm thrilled to have you say that as well. And I think languages can also open opportunities, and your film does both. I
wanted to add one thing. You asked about connecting. We had a wonderful cinematographer named Japhet Weeks, who was an American, but he spoke fluent Russian. And that also made all the difference. The characters just loved him. He's this sort of good looking, strapping guy who spoke fluent Russian. And, it was really fantastic. Sometimes he would have to haul the water and stuff before they'd sit down for an interview though.
So a kind of key to unlock the door too.
Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. I'd love to hear about if there were aspects of this project. You've told about the story of its making and how that evolved, but were there aspects of the project that evolved unexpectedly, or did your opinion of these women and their choices evolve, over time as you were making the film or producing it back home? Yeah,
it did evolve. I think that going in, my first impression when I heard about the community there and saw them was like, what are they crazy? And are they sick? And I think that over the course of time and coming to truly understand the larger, more nuanced picture, I think that I thought I was going in making a film about Chernobyl, and I think I came out making a film about home. And that was what really sort of just rose to the surface when their true realities and what drove them came out, or at least became apparent to me. And so it became this complicated story film-wise, and I hope we achieved what we wanted to, which is that, yes, obviously, or well, maybe not obviously, I mean, Chernobyl is a dangerous place, and the disaster was a horrible thing, and it is not that they haven't been exposed to serious health risks. However, the palliative powers of home and living a self-determined life are also real things. So when you look at what happened to the Babushkas who accepted relocation, who moved into the cities after a life in a beloved village on their motherland, and then they lived in an apartment in a city, there were negative health outcomes to that. And so it becomes a complicated equation. And I wanted that to be present in the film. So it wasn't a simple story of disaster or a simple story of overblown concerns about health, because that's not true either.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think you really open up the paradoxes, and I think you achieved that goal of getting exactly that across, and that we go through that evolution, I think, watching the film. Now, when I was rewatching the film, I was struck by your choice, the way that you begin the film, with one older woman's seemingly normal life and her interactions with nature, before you add these these things, these details about Chernobyl, for example, and illuminate the invisible hazards more and more. And I'd love to, may have some suspicions, but I'd love to hear, why you choose to start there the way you do.
Yeah, so the film starts with Valentina, who is going out fishing, as she does every day. And it's this long walk with some traditional music, and she's just sort of singing to herself. And I think it's, I loved it, and I'm an angler myself, so I had a soft spot for her fishing passion. But the image embodied a lot, because it was, first of all, it's an old woman being, talking to herself, being happy, going down to fish in a river that's quite contaminated, once you realize you're in the Chernobyl zone. And then she turns to the camera at the end and says, I'm never gonna leave, something to that effect. You have to shoot me, I'm staying here. And that encapsulated, I think, the core message from a lot of the women we talked to there. But also it told you pretty quickly that this is not going to be your typical Chernobyl film. And it didn't start with, we did have to then rewind and remind people what the Chernobyl disaster was when it happened, the gravity of it. And then we did that, but it was not the fuel in which this film was going to drive on. And so those are some of the reasons we chose that. I will tell you, the film that I have coming out in the fall is an expedition film, a polar expedition film. And it starts with one of the characters, a Pakistani character in a hijab, pulling a tire through the streets of industrial Manchester, England. So it's, I think, another way of saying, this is not your father's expedition film or whatever it may be, but it's a story that she's driving this ship, and she's going to tell this story, and this is her story. And so that was with same with Valentina and the fishing.
Yeah, and you do indeed tell a very human story. Absolutely. Thank you. And I'd love to return to the mention of nature you made at the beginning in response to my first question, and in thinking about also the ecology of disaster, our conference, and thinking about the ecological impact. So in your film, you have the quote, "Here in the exclusion zone, life never stopped, nature just took over." And I'd love to hear more about the nature of the area and this natural resurgence that we hear about, or evidence to the contrary.
Yeah, you might, I'm not a scientist, but I will tell you from a layperson's perspective, yes. So one is immediately taken by the beauty and the of the area, and the fact that there's been, because the absence of humans has been, relative. So when there were humans there, right, they were taking out the animals couldn't survive. When there are not humans, they came surging back. So you have wild horses, you have wild boar, you have deer, and I think there's even some bear, and all. So it's become this sort of unlikely wildlife refuge. It's not to say that those animals themselves have not, and again, you know more about this than me, but it's not to say they haven't had negative effects from the radiation. They have, and that's an ongoing area of study. And, for example, some species who would have, 3 young would only have 1, and, things like that. So there are physiological impacts. But, to the lay eye, you just sort of see this crazy sort of nature reserve, and not reserve, but, nature, it just looks like it's booming. And, animals coming in and out of, abandoned houses, and it's just it's very surreal. So I know there's lots of studies ongoing about the animals in the region, and yeah, I'm not sure the latest information. I mean, there's also lots of myths, right? Like there was the containment pond for the water from the nuclear plant. And there's giant fish in it, like, huge catfish. I think they're catfish from what I could tell. And, I believe the myth is, oh, they're giant because they're radioactive, these giant radioactive fish. But the reality is the workers of the zone like throw them bread, and they're sort of like fattened up, by that. And and then there's the kind of mythology around, all the animals are born with, missing a leg and sort of dramatic aberrations, which I don't think is true. But like I said, first of all, I'm not a scientist, but there are plenty of adverse effects on the animals. It's just that they're not quite as obvious as the stereotype might lend itself to.
Yeah, and thinking about the impact of the removal of humans from the area in terms of animals.
Right.
Is very interesting.
Another interesting story, which I never covered, and it's not in the film, is that, it's tough times economically in Ukraine, and people are hunting for food. And so there is a sort of culture, small illegal subculture of people hunting inside the zone. And that's super dangerous, because if you go there, the first thing you'll be told is don't eat anything. That's the most important thing, is not to eat food that's been grown there, or in the case of animals, that's grown up there. But there is hunting that goes on illegally. And also, of course, animals are animals. They leave the zone and are hunted outside the zone. I know that the Sami people and the reindeer in northern Norway and up there in different places are quite have a lot of radioactive contamination within the reindeer, because they love the moss, right? And they eat the moss, and the people eat the reindeer. So there's sort of just ongoing. I believe also, again, probably a lot of people on this call know more about this than I do, but the wild boar in Germany and other Eastern European countries, because of the contamination from Chernobyl and their affinity for moss and mushrooms and the things that retain contaminants, that these animals are pretty contaminated still.
Yeah, the long-term effects of the fallout, absolutely. I'd love to shift a little bit here and returning also to the themes of your past work, and thinking about the experiences of women here and these supportive communities of women that emerge so strongly in your film. So, and mostly it is women living in here. And I'd love to hear more about these communities of women, and whether you think, and you alluded to this already, but the significance of these communities in terms of promoting their longevity and well-being despite the circumstances in which they live.
Right. Well, I think, yes. So maintaining connection to their homeland and where they grew up, and the graves of their parents or their children, and all of those things, I think, are contributed to their survival, and also the fact that the returnees maintain community for decades. Now, I mean, I will say that at the time we were making the film, there were some 200-ish people inside the zone, and now I think it's around 50. So their numbers are dwindling, and the communities are less robust, and people are old, simply older, in their 80s and up. But I do feel that for part of their survival over time was because they did have community. And also I think there was the luck of the draw. I mean, some villages got quite contaminated and other villages didn't, because of the nature of this it was a nuclear fire that lasted for, I don't know, like something like 2 weeks. I can't remember, 11 days, 2 weeks. So it spread all over unevenly. So some villages were super contaminated, and people were buried, right? They just literally buried as a remediation tactic. Others were quite contaminated, not buried. Others were just less contaminated. And so it was a bit of a checkerboard and unpredictable how just sort of in terms of the physical contamination, how that would go. But yes, like I said earlier, I think the community idea and the connection to home are factors in one's health. And I think that relocation trauma is a very real thing, and that you see it in relocated peoples all over the world. Not maybe whether it's refugees or ecological disaster, whatever it may be. There's higher rates of unemployment, alcoholism, all kinds of things that go with the trauma of relocation. So by staying, they were able to avoid that. Also, one kind of important thing, medically speaking, is that these women were old, considered old. I mean, in their 50s, which I don't think is that old, but at the time of the accident. And older animals, including people here, are less affected, less negative effects of radiation. So the children, for example, of Chernobyl, had the worst time of it all. And even now, you cannot go into the zone if you're under 18. So because they were older when they had this experience, it impacted them a little bit less. And there's lots of thyroid cancer and whatnot, but yeah, so that is another factor in it all. When they came back, they were sneaking back into the zone, literally, because at first the authorities said nobody can come back, nobody can come back. And then people would sneak back, and they sometimes relocate them again, and they sneak back again. And finally they kind of just said, okay, let the old people stay. They'll die, but they'll die happy on their motherland, and they're old anyway. But in fact, that's not exactly how it all played out.
Yeah, I'd love to follow up on that. This fierce independence and self-determination and self-sufficiency these women show is really remarkable. And I find myself, also thinking about how they might be rejecting aspects of life outside the exclusion zone, where, because as you say, because of their love for their motherland, their home villages, that they feel like they would be worse off there. So do you then paradoxically find that these women get a greater sense of freedom here within the exclusion zone? And are they also able to exercise more freedom precisely because they are older women, that they somehow get to step outside of these restrictions that are governing
right
choices for other people?
Well, they are definitely living outside the restrictions of the zone. I mean, technically speaking, no one is supposed to be there, even though for decades now they've turned a blind eye. They, meaning the authorities of the zone, have turned a blind eye, and they've become part of the culture of it. So on one hand, that offers them freedom. On the other hand, I will say that there's still a certain amount of fear among the women I talk to that they will still be removed. I mean, it's not actually, it will not happen, and I'm quite sure of that. But there was always this fear because they were essentially there illegally, and there was a sense of, we won't get our pensions, which is pretty serious. So, on one hand, there is this sense of, it's more there are a lot of downsides. I don't want to glorify their existence too much, because it is extremely hard. And, a lot of the services that were extended to them early on, like early on in post-disaster, there was a regular bus that went to a town outside of the zone where they could get groceries, things like that. And as the economy's deteriorated and the numbers of returnees are dwindling, some of the services that were afforded them, healthcare, for example, like a doctor would go around periodically, that's gone away, so they're even more alone, and that's not good. So yes, I would say, you know, a lot of the most, I would say, of the women we talked to had the opportunity to leave, you know, like their adult children said, come live with me or whatever. Not everybody, but for many of them, and they chose not to, even though it meant that their opportunities to see their own kids was then limited, because they could only come in, you know, a couple times a year, things like that. So yeah, overall, I'd say it adds up to freedom, but there's a price to it.
Certainly, yeah. And I'd love to follow up on this theme, and we spoke about this actually a little bit before we began too, about the place of fear in the film and in the filmmaking and in these women's lives. So they said, you know, don't be afraid of us, we don't contain radiation, but we also glimpse, no doubt deliberately, fear, like when the Geiger counters or the scientists who are coming disrupt their usual lives, and maybe the kind of ignorance that is bliss, right, of the exact impact. So did you see a lot of evidence of this, of fear, and what was it like as a visitor? Did the presence of fear change over time?
Well, I mean, I think, well, there was the fear as a visitor, but that what a visitor has, but in terms of their fear, as I mentioned, there was some fear of the authorities, just in fact that somebody will move them, essentially, like they're going to try to make us all live in the same village or make us leave the zone. Though that was a real fear that was, I feel somewhat unfounded, but ultimately it was a real fear. But of course, the fear of contamination. I mean, some people were, you know, as Hannah said in the film, radiation doesn't scare me, starvation does, because she is a woman who was you know, an infant during, you know, when Stalin and his thugs were there, right? So they starved that population, and so she just tells a story of narrowly, it's not in the film, but narrowly escaping being, you know, the villagers were turning to some pretty horrible means to stay alive. And so she barely survived Stalin's famines. And so radiation meant nothing to her. She's like, radiation doesn't scare me, starvation does. And that is a value she held throughout. She would never leave. Now, the woman in the, with the mushrooms, with the Geiger counters. So periodically, we call them the eco-testers, but these sort of scientists periodically came around and tested the water, and these were Ukrainian officials, and the water and the food, and the dosimeter goes off quite with those mushrooms, because mushrooms have a very, again, are one of the things that grows that really maintains the contamination, and you know that scared her. And, you know, she's not dumb. She knows, you know, that there's been a nuclear disaster and around that. But I do think that it's not just the women in the zone, people of the whole region. There can be a certain amount of complacency around the food. But that, from my perspective, you know, they may think I wouldn't agree with me. But yeah, she was scared. She knew that those were contaminated, and you don't hear it on a daily basis, but when a guy shows up twice a year and confirms something, but you might notice in the film, he kind of went, don't tell her, you know, like, let's just move on, because I believe his perspective was, yes, they're contaminated. Yes, she's going to eat them. and, you know, it's, again, part of this sort of narrative around the women of like, let them just be happy and live their lives, and not put fear into them at this point. So, you know, I don't know the morality around all that. I mean, people are in the region, you know, afforded a certain amount of, you know, I guess money to sort of compensate to get clean food. But as I understand it, it's not a system that really works, and it's very little money. So it's sort of like, yeah, so I don't think that's relevant for the women in the zone. They're growing their own food. They're eating their own food. Sometimes their adult kids bring them meat and things like that.
Yeah, thank you. And I found myself thinking about how, these women and older women in general act as kinds of custodians of culture, memory, and place. And, as you said, the numbers are dwindling, based on, from 200 to 50. So did you also feel that these women are kind of repositories of memory, like the herbal knowledge, one of them was
Yeah.
sharing, or these memories of Chernobyl and even of the past, as I'm glad you brought that in, because otherwise I would have liked to, of these past traumas that have shaped these women and made them able to withstand something like this. So I'm wondering if the film is, consciously trying to preserve these.
Yeah, we try to, by bringing up the past in terms of what the region has survived in the past, and how, as I said, Hannah might compare surviving Stalin to an invisible enemy, which is sort of abstract to her. I also think we try to bring traditional music into it, and they're singing. We had lots of, actually, tons of footage of singing. Often people would break into song, and use that wherever we could. There was a scene, a couple of scenes of the women who were relocated. They were in a town outside the village, and such sadness there, and such loss. And the mournful songs they sang were just, pretty heartbreaking. And they were still singing about the village they had left, they had been forced out of, that had been buried 35 years ago, and still grieving that. So in order to preserve the culture, yeah, I mean, I think these women are the last reservoirs, because as you know, and the people on this call know, that there's very, as I understand it, the cultures are quite regional, right? It could be a songs from a certain village, or food from a certain region, or whatever. And there's this huge area where that's all going to, that knowledge and all that music and all that culture will die with them, and their children left at too young of age to have absorbed it all. And I will, just as an aside, mention that someone, a wonderful playwright named Amy Wheeler, and some colleagues are making a play based on the Babushkas of Chernobyl, and it's going to be a musical. And they're doing all this incredible, working with these regional musicians and songwriters, and sort of, again, trying to preserve some of these cultural elements, especially music.
Yeah, and as your film also does, and kind of encapsulating and preserving these stories. And thank you for helping us to anticipate this kind of follow-up to this project, and also mentioning some other work that we can look forward to of yours in the Arctic. And I'd love to turn it now to some audience questions. And I'd like to begin with a question from Ryan Kenyon, who asks, when was the last time you spoke with the Babushkas? Also, do you know if they are okay, since, with COVID and everything?
Yeah, well, ironically, they're quite protected from COVID, I believe, because they don't really see anybody. So as far as I know, COVID hasn't entered the zone. I mean, probably the zone workers, there's an amount of COVID there, because there are plenty of people who still work maintaining the defunct reactor and the borders and whatnot. But let's see. As far as I know, COVID hasn't been an issue, and I suspect they're probably okay, given their significant isolation. They live the life that we've all lived for the last year, except no internet. So Marina spoke to them. Maybe I haven't spoken to anybody in just a while. We went, but Marina had sort of went into the zone, and we passed messages back and forth. After the film came out, we returned to the zone and did a little, we did a screening, because of course, as we know, the women want to stay home. They didn't want to come out to a film festival, but we did a screening in Hannah's Village, and we went around the zone and picked up all the characters and did it. And it was an unbelievable experience, which I could go on about, we don't have time, but it was really good. And we filmed that experience, and so we'll do a DVD extra soon, something like that.
Oh, well, I'll look forward to that. Wonderful. Thanks for sharing that. We also have questions about from the audience about, and I would have otherwise asked about this too, the juxtaposition between these older women living there under certain circumstances, and then the young men stalkers who come in, and these kinds of intergenerational encounters that we see. So Jeff asks, one of the most striking moments for me was the encounter between one of the babushkas and the group of stalkers seeking out Pripyat. While we see a scientist condemn these stalkers as intrusive elements earlier on, how did you view their presence in the scope of your documentary, in contrast to the sense of home established throughout?
So I think that they were, in a way, in their own way, it was a coming home for them as well, because this was the sort of ground zero of the tragedy in their own lives, even though they had a different experience of it as the babushkas. I also think, they kind of represented this generation, the younger generation, the grandchildren of these babushkas, even though they weren't necessarily literally the grandchildren. So I don't think they were just thrill seek. My feeling is it was something deeper than just thrill seeking or reckless activity. People feel really drawn to the zone, and as dangerous as it is, that's genuine.
Yeah, I appreciate very much how the film, really uncovers these powerful, human motivations and the deeper stories there. Tyler, for example, was asking, I was really moved by the scenes showing the babushkas cultivating food in their gardens and foraging mushrooms in particular, given the scene that features a scientist describing the way mushrooms grow in enormous networks that spread out across political and administrative boundaries, absorbing radiation from areas far from where they are actually foraged. It reminded me of my own Ukrainian grandmother's deep love of foraging and respect for the land. Can you speak a bit how these practices of cultivation become risky, political, not only in the context of nuclear fallout, but also given the histories of famine, forcible agricultural reform, and so on in the former USSR?
Yeah, no, that's very insightful. I would just say it's just, there's such a deep cultural component too. I mean, I sort of joked about you have to sit down and eat a meal before you can roll a camera, but I mean, there's so much human connection and hospitality, and how you show love for love and gratitude and hospitality and all these things. So that's a factor too. It's not just it's not just about sustenance, the traditional kind of sustenance.
Yeah, so much culture, wrapped up in food. That must have been interesting to navigate there too, as a visitor.
They would laugh at us because we'd like bring a cake from Kyiv and be like, we've brought our own food, because we didn't want to eat the local mushrooms and whatnot. And they would laugh and say, "You're so scared of radiation." And we're like, "Yeah, we are."
So that returns to this issue too of, of like kind of cultures, building bridges across cultures, where the cultures are also sort of just inside and outside the zone, right? Not necessarily by nation or, but by practices, living practices. Thank you. I'd love to share also a question from Lisbeth, who was asking about how you center the lives of women and whether you interviewed any of their children and consider including their perspectives, their stories or feelings.
We did. I don't believe there's anything in the film, but we actually, for a long time there was. It ended up getting something that cut out. There was a woman named Valentina, a different Valentina. And her daughter was probably in her 40s. And we interviewed her and spent time with her. She lives outside the zone, and we filmed with her. Actually, we made a short film, a separate short film, and she was evacuated from Pripyat. She worked at Pripyat she worked at the nuclear power plant. And so we went back with her to her apartment, where she had to evacuate on a moment's notice. Well, they were told they were going to be evacuated for 2 days, and it was, 35 years. But like we go back to her apartment, and there's, her shoes are still there and all this kind of thing. And it was very emotional for her. And her mother still lives in the zone. Her mother has since passed away. But yeah, so I mean, the generational trauma is huge. And even though not many people are left in the zone, the impacts of life there before and after are, you can't underestimate them.
Yeah, and this kind of disruption of that continuity too, of the dislocation, also of generations. I think that's really powerful, and connects to with this theme of the fallout, and the ecology of disaster more broadly. So I want to take this opportunity to thank you so much, Holly, for coming virtually to join us and giving us this opportunity to engage and ask questions about your fabulous film. Which we can all return to as well. And I wanted to thank also the audience for joining us today. And I wanted to conclude by mentioning how much I think your film really resonates in new ways, and probably will continue to resonate in new ways, as the future moves on, in these, as you indicate too, these times of isolation and fear and contamination, and all those impacts, how they're affecting us today. So, I think can be perhaps continually a new film in that way as well.
Climate refugees, will be. There's will be a lot of overlapping themes in there, I think.
Absolutely. And let me also thank you too for, opening up all these subjects, which we hope to continue with in the conference tomorrow, to which everyone is invited to join us as well. Exactly, because what happened in Chernobyl 35 years ago, is also, showcasing what, ecological disaster looks like. And exactly as you indicate, climate change and impacts. This is perhaps we can gain a lot of wisdom from these extraordinary women whose stories you share, right? Who are these kind of custodians of these memories and these experiences. And maybe as we face our own modern day challenges, we can learn something from the fierce spirit and indomitable will of these Babushkas of Chernobyl. So thank you so much, Holly.
Thank you for having me, and good luck with the conference.
Thank you.